Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is the Community of Practice, Community Planning and Zoning. And so we have done this in the past, but we're getting back to doing some webinars. So this is way different than it was done in the past. So we're excited to have this forum to do that. So, and please note, it was up on the last slide. We are having another webinar focused on climate change and community impacts on June 7th, and you'll be receiving information about that. I'm trying to get AICP CM credits for that. So with that, I want to introduce our speaker for today. His name is Mark Hostetler. He's from the University of Florida. He is a professor in wildlife ecology and conservation. That's in Gainesville, Florida. He has an extension and research appointment. He works on all sorts of different things, but developing, researching, and implementing educational programs about wildlife issues and natural resource conservation on a variety of different topics. Biodiversity, urban landscape design and management, and then strategies to create resource efficient communities through planning and policy. So today he is going to be talking about a new online evaluation tool that evaluates the impacts of subdivision design on bird habitats. And as this goes on, I will share a guidebook with you. It will lead you to the guidebook. And what else do I want to say? That's it. That's all I want to say. Mark, welcome, and thank you for being our first speaker of this new webinar series.
Thanks, Anna. Well, hello out there. Unfortunately, you will see me as a name only, no face to the name right now. I don't have a webcam in the office, but what I'm going to be speaking about today is I'm going to give you a little background about kind of conserving biodiversity when land is developed, and then what I think is really the interesting evolution of this is we've been speaking with a lot of designers and planners, and they usually speak about in terms of, you know, we need a biodiversity tool. Where's a tool where we could actually see how different designs impacts, for in this example, bird habitat. So the first part, I kind of go through kind of a heuristic look at who are the decision makers in and around cities. And then next, kind of talk a little bit about conservation developments. A lot that we work through University of Florida and with our collaborators is try to create these model communities that adopt new designs and practices to conserve biodiversity. And that's the link that Anna was talking about. There's this, I only highlighted a few of these items, but most of the details are in the course manual itself. And then the last part of the talk will be going through this new online Building for Birds tool. So when you think about development, if you're probably from various states around the country, but in Florida, we typically have two sides. We have the developers on one side and the tree huggers and bird watchers on the other side. And you usually see each other in court. And it's a win-lose proposition. But in Florida, we're going from 18 million to about 36 million people in 50 years. So what's the middle ground? How do we accommodate people and still conserve our natural heritage? And when you think about the people within and around cities, there's various levels of decisions that are being made. You have this, I'll go through a Southwest example. This is in Arizona, where you have two homeowners. One on the left has done turf grass in the middle of the desert, and the one on the right has done saguaro and cacti and xeriscaping. And you can imagine those decisions, that suite of people that you're trying to reach and engage with can make decisions within days and change their landscape, and cumulatively it can have quite a big impact. But think about what comes along with this group of decision makers, and before they can even make a decision, there's another group at another level, what I call the built environment professionals. These are developers, environmental consultants, landscape architects, engineers, etc., who really set the tone for the whole neighborhood, how big the homes are, where the lots go, where built structure goes versus conserved open space, if any, whether you use native or exotics. And you can imagine if you drive down a neighborhood that's already set in terms of what landscaping is there, it's hard to change, even if you're a homeowner, to change like 80% turf grass in the front yard all up and down the road. It's hard to change that because the norm for the community has already been set in stone. But then there's another level of decision makers, and when we're thinking about doing something alternative, is also the city planners and elected officials, and with public input, you know, like in Florida and elsewhere, they do land use maps and development plans of how a city's going to grow, and that comes with a whole suite of land development regulations that somewhat constrain what developers and built environment professionals can do, and even what homeowners can do. So you also have to think about this level of decision making when you're doing something unique within a city. And there's lots of perspectives, right? So I just threw up this cartoon. A tree can be very different from different disciplines when they look at a tree. So suffice to say, you know, where do we go from here? I mean, like this, I know I can't hear the laughter out there, but this poor raccoon went in through the cat door, got full of cat food and couldn't get back out, got stuck. That was heavy gloves and some Vaseline to get that poor critter out of there. And they're not nice and cute when they're at this stage. So where do you go from here? How do you reach all these homeowners, developers, policymakers, and planners at these different decision-making levels? And it's really about engagement, and through extension, you know, you're thinking about in terms of trained and motivated policymakers and regulators, and trained and motivated developers, contractors, that whole suite of built environment professionals, and you also have that whole realm of educated, motivated citizens. At the University of Florida, we formed a group, kind of think of it like an extension consulting team. It's called the Program for Resource Efficient Communities. And the whole idea behind that is with a city or a developer wants to do something a little bit different or has an issue, how can we come in and actually advise and make recommendations? And much of that we've been concentrating on for the past 17 years now, is doing what we call conservation developments. And the way I define conservation developments is when you subdivide the land, it's a way to conserve natural resources on the site and also to minimize impact on surrounding areas. Now, some critters we don't have to worry about. You know, I'm not sure about gray squirrels in your area. It's more about wildlife-human conflict. And it's about changing human behavior. So, for example, raccoons, when they invade chimneys and up in the Northeast and other parts of the country, it's all about you can't change the behavior of the wild animal. You got to change the behavior of what humans do. So when you think about conservation developments, there's 3 phases, and we spent a lot of time on the design phase, but I'm going to argue that it's just as important to pay attention to the construction and the post-construction phase. And going through, and there's a lot more detail in the manual that you have access to, but there's a lot of site design issues that can have lots of impacts depending on how the site is designed. You know, a fragmented versus compact design can have a huge impact on natural resources. So to highlight a few practices, you know, think about preserving high quality natural areas. You know, the least disturbed areas probably have the highest number of native species. So if you have your choice between rangeland or a forested area, probably the forested area is a better choice to conserve. And if you think in terms of creating a network of open space, you can benefit both the human aesthetics and wildlife habitat. So here's an example of a sanctuary or riparian corridor that's been conserved. Instead of putting the pathway all the way through the corridor right next to the river, which destroys a lot of the habitat for many species who can't breed around human activity, you have the trail outside the sanctuary and dips in for a view and then goes back out again. So there are compromises that you can do. The other thing I would like to highlight is about conserving all wetlands. Now, I do understand, and I say this with a little grain of salt here, that it may be that conserving all wetlands can actually decrease the natural resource conservation value for a property. So you can imagine a very fragmented landscape with small wetlands that are surrounded by built infrastructure. Those can compromise, every single wetland that's conserved, and these could be used to create enhanced stormwater retention areas. And instead of thinking of doing all the wetlands, you might actually consider, in some cases, that you design a compact community and fill in a few wetlands, the more dilapidated wetlands that are out there. Now, again, you have to be careful with this because people could take the ball and run with it and say, oh, it's carte blanche to fill in wetlands. But no, it's a way to really look at things and think about the full site itself in terms of conserving biodiversity. So let's say you have the design done pretty well. Now you have construction issues and you have a huge amount of impacts. You're moving dirt around, you're uprooting vegetation. You can imagine all the impacts that can happen during this time that can compromise even the best design that's on paper. And it's really about protecting the vegetation and the soil, and there's many techniques that can kill trees and dramatically impact any conserved natural area that's in or near the site that's being subdivided. So thinking about, for example, proper fencing of drip lines, you need at least fencing, a real sturdy fence around the drip line of trees. It protects only about 50% of the roots. But typically what you see is something like this. You'll see in the foreground, in the background there near the bulldozer, you have a group of trees marked for protection. There's slim ropes on there, and it's not, it's actually underneath the drip line. So here's two things where the bulldozer has scraped away the earth and scraped away the roots and then piled the soil on top and next to the trunk. And so it's just smothering the roots, and those trees will die over time. Silt fences are important. How many's been on a construction site where the silt fences have been maintained properly over the entire length of the construction period? Typically, you will see things like on the right here where things break down. It only takes a few rain events for the pollutants and particulates to go into a water body to compromise a water body that you were trying to protect over the long term. So even earthwork machines like Florida and elsewhere, it's hot out, they'll park into the underneath the trees. Of course, those heavy machineries compacts the soil to the point where it becomes almost the percolation factor is way decreased. And now in the future, that soil that's supposed to capture some of the water before it runs off into the nearby water body, now it will run right into the water body. And even think about earthwork machines moving from site to site. I mean, a highly disturbed site is a perfect venue for invasive exotics to take control. So how do you do it in a way that you minimize the spread of invasive exotics? You need to check the earthwork machines when they move from site to site that they don't have propagules or seeds from invasives from one site to the next. And even stem wall construction. I mean, a lot of times people will use natives and they will forget about the soil. So they'll do slab on grade, bring in some sterile fill dirt and fill that out right up to the foundation. And then they put natives on top of that, or even turf grass. And it's not going to survive, particularly in Florida where we have sandy loam soil. So it's just, they rip it up, put in new, and there's a lot of irrigation and fertilizer. So the idea is to build the house up above the 100-year flood zone event and keep all the soil biota and organic matter around the house, and then you put your landscaping in. Now, we've gone through design and construction. Now think about post-construction issues. There's many of them. Now you have people moving into these communities, and are they actually behaving and managing their homes, yards, and neighborhoods in a way that promotes long-term conservation of natural resources? And even small areas can compromise even the large conserved areas. So going through a number of smart growth types of conferences and green development conferences, I was asking the question back in 2000, well, are the residents in these green communities any different than the ones that are in conventional communities? Because if they're going to know a little bit about the natural history and the natural resource conservation, there should be some difference. Well, we did some studies or some citations there. All homeowners score low in terms of environmental attitudes, knowledge, or behaviors. And there's no difference between the green communities, the conventional communities. Sale office information is not adequate. Homeowners forget the information over time, particularly when homes flip. But homeowners desire local environmental information. So I think developers can do something to engage with residents, even during the design phase. Think about how can they design engagement activities to educate people that move into these conservation communities. So I throw this guy up here. This is Dr. Ray Carthy. I just saw him this morning. He has not seen this photo. And I throw him up there as, how do you read a typical homeowner here in Florida or elsewhere who has their pool, their backyard, and the barbecue, etc. And the graduate students and I designed an educational system, which is signs that you see along sidewalks, a website, and covenants, environmental covenants, and a brochure that the homeowners get when they buy their homes. Now, what's important about these signs is that they do address really kind of interesting and topics that are specific to the community, but also they're dynamic. What I mean by dynamic is that these are all aluminum frames, signs, and they're stalled along pathways. But you can imagine this is at a bus stop here, or a school bus stop in this one neighborhood. People see this information and the sun can fade it out, or they just, oh, okay, we learned about water-wise landscaping. What else could we learn? Well, the neat thing about these signs is you can pop off the end of them and print out a new panel, which is only about $100 instead of like $700 to $800 to do a whole new graphic display unit. And you can have a number of different panels that can address a number of different issues. And we've done some research on this. We've compared communities with or without this educational system, and they do improve in terms of applying practices and attitudes, knowledge, and behaviors. And of those three components, most of them use the dynamic signs. The website sometimes visited, but definitely the covenants and brochure, no one read those. But another issue, post-construction, who's managing open space? I mean, who's doing, if you need to do prescribed burns or invasive exotic, who's responsible and who pays for it? That's typically not addressed very well because it takes money to do this. So you got to secure permanent funding where it could be like a portion of lot sales or development rights when you do easements, or from larger properties with leases. And what we found with some of the smaller developments is monthly contribution to HOA, homeowner association dues can work, and also property taxes that go towards management itself. So I'm going to end this section of the presentation with the idea: when you do a conservation development, you have to address all three of these phases. And typically we spend all our time in design, which is important, but we really need a lot more policy, a lot more engagement with decision makers during the construction and the post-construction phase. Okay, so I'm going to, whoops, got lost here. I'm going to go to and do a new share here and talk about this new tool. So that kind of gives you a backdrop of how to do communities that conserve natural resources. But whenever we were in meetings with environmental consultants or city planners, they're like, well, to really address wildlife, particularly if we're going to talk about birds here, how can we do it in a way where we can compare one design versus another design? And that's important to do. and in reality, we have lots of issues with that because the consultants and city planners don't have the resources to hire good urban wildlife ecologists to come in there and actually do these assessments. So this is what I'm going to talk about in the next 15 minutes is really how can we do it in a way that it's easier, it's a free online tool, and it's not something that you need a wildlife biologist to come to the site itself. So what I'm first going to do is do a background about avian ecology. I'm not going to assume everyone knows about birds, just really quickly about avian ecology, and then I'm going to go into the evaluation tool itself. So what's the problem? There's no simple evaluation tool that translates empirical research into a practical usable information for urban land developers. So for example, let's say you have to conserve 40% of the property in forest. Do you do it on like design on the left, and what impacts does it have on the suites of species, or do you do it like on the right? And when you do a design, how can you compare one scenario versus another? And how it impacts in this situation, we're concentrating on forest birds. Now, when we're concentrating on forest birds, to think about their life history stages, it's important when we're thinking about a tool, because if you think about the breeding phase versus the non-reproductive phase, when you go from egg to baby bird to immature adult to reproductive adult, they may require different resources and different types of habitat during those different phases, during the different stages. And I'll throw out one example here with the hummingbird. The hummingbird is, a lot of people put out those nectar feeders, and they enjoy seeing the ruby-throated if you're out east come into these feeders. But during the breeding season, they can't just feed their chicks pure sugar water. They have to have insects, and the chicks need protein for the chicks to develop. So really, it's about conserving not only the native flowers around there, perhaps putting up a hummingbird feeder, but also the insect diversity is very important for the that life stage for the hummingbird. And even spiders are really important, because the nest is almost entirely made of spider web and some other things. And so if you're getting rid of all your spiders within the habitat, you're not going to have enough nesting material for the ruby-throated hummingbird and other hummingbirds. And when you think about the seasons of a bird, you have breeding, wintering, and migration season. Those different life stages can have different habitat requirements. So there are like year-round species. I kind of give the southeast example, where you have the mockingbirds, Carolina chickadee. You'll see them all year round. But then there's what we call migratory species. So like the red-eyed vireo, it breeds in Florida. It's a migrant, but it disappears during the winter. The American goldfinch is not here in Florida at all during the winter. During the summer, but appears in Florida in the winter. And the American redstart is a migrant that actually you only see during the spring and fall migration period, like a 2 to 3 week period, as it's going up to the north part of the United States and Canada, and migrating to South America and Central America. So an example of this, for example, like the yellow warbler. When you have the yellow warbler, it's breeding, you can see up above Georgia, it's migrating through the southeast and in the southwest, and then to Mexico and the Colombian Basin. So I think the take-home message from this is that a site can serve as a breeding site, a wintering site, a stopover site, or dispersal site. So a lot of people only think breeding, but there's a lot of different values for small, and you'll see for small fragments and trees, for even birds that breed in continuous large forest patches. To go over what we did, we took this project on a couple years ago. We're now beta testing this online tool. So I'm going to present this tool, and I like for people to try it out and give feedback how it works within their own design process or decision process. What we did is we broke up the research into breeding, stopover, and what we call urban types of empirical studies. These are all published peer-reviewed papers. we reviewed those, and what we tried to do is, for example, during the breeding season, try to find those species that will not breed in fragments. These are what we call interior forest specialists, and a lot of times some of these species were a little controversial whether they were interior forest specialists or not, but now I think we do have a definitive list of 17 species that would be considered interior forest specialists. During stopover, we again looked at a variety of studies that looked at various patch sizes. We found species that will use pretty small fragments from 0.7 to 20 hectares in size, mostly long-distance neotropical migrants, and a lot of these were interior forest specialists during the breeding season. And in the kind of the built environment review, these are like urban studies and residential commercial areas. We saw a lot of species, kind of species that love edges during the breeding season, but also a lot of species that are not edge species during the breeding season, using tree canopy cover at stopover sites. So for example, here, the American redstart, it breeds and requires large tracts of forests, at least 1,000 acres in the area. And it's called an interior forest specialist, but during migration, it does use small urban forest patches and even individual trees in residential areas. So that kind of gives background about the tool itself. I'm going to kind of go through a demonstration about how it works online. It's free. Essentially what it will do is kind of give you, like if you did a scenario on the left, same amount of acreage conserve versus the right, how does it impact the breeding, the stopover, and the built environment types of habitats for different species. This is the website. If you just Google Building for Birds, University of Florida, you can click on that button, use the tool. And we first started with GIS and all kinds of iterations, but we quickly realized, talking with designers and planners, that it's really pretty complicated. So we went to a menu-driven type of system. So you can use any area throughout North America, and all you have to do is put in the patch sizes of conserved late and early successional forests, and I'll describe that in a second. And the second input is conserving how much tree canopy in acres is actually going to be conserved post-development. So here's the first step, is really putting just information about the site and choosing your scenario 1 or scenario 2. Then it goes to putting in an amount of acres that are conserved late successional versus early successional forests. And so to give an example of that, if you do the aerial, you can imagine tree canopy. If you look up, you see tree canopy and large trees, and woodpeckers could make holes in them. That's really late successional forest. So in the white areas, that's late successional. The black is early successional. And if you're on the ground in Florida, this is what late successional forest would look like. And that was what early successional forest would look like. So just think woodpeckers wouldn't do well in that habitat. And the reason why we did this, we gave more points for late successional forest fragments because it takes many years to grow big trees. So we gave more points for keeping that versus early successional. And the surrounding areas, the edges around late successional forest, is actually early successional type of edge that a lot of species that use early successional habitat would use. Now, for the stopover habitat, we did find in the literature that yes, they use small fragments, but slightly larger fragments, like 17 acres or larger versus 5 acres, would attract more species. So we gave more points for larger patches that were conserved. And then finally, the last step is to enter how many acres of conserved tree canopy cover is going to be conserved after development. Outputs are fairly simple. It just gives you sort of like a score, and the score is only relevant to that site itself, because if you have a huge site versus a small site, you're going to get different score numbers. But it's really to compare one site design versus another. So to give you an example of this, let's say you had 100 acres, you're going to develop 50% of it. This is how much you're going to conserve, 30 acres. You have no acres of early successional forests being conserved post-development, but 50 of the 70 acres late successional. And you enter those numbers in, and it's a very simple algorithm. It's just points times acres, right? So you get more points for late successional forests versus early successional, and you get more points for larger fragments versus smaller fragments. And then for tree canopy, you just get a point per acre. When you enter those numbers in, it will spit out a score. You can imagine those bars shifting as you go from one design to the next. And that's where I think is very important, because then you can evaluate why different designs would be better for birds during the stopover or during the breeding season. Now, the numbers on the bottom are not relevant. I mean, in terms of they're not telling you anything. It's just a relevant score, right? It's not like you're going to get like the number 50 species here. It's just saying that's the score for that site. It's dependent on how big the site and how much forest you have to begin with. Now, the real thing I like to hang my hat on is we have a list of 215 species where we started really going down into the weeds as ecologists, but the planners, the designers we were working with said, no, we want checks and X's. Which birds breed in forest fragments, which use them as stopover, which breed in residential areas, and which use them as stopover. Simple as that. And so we have that for over 215 species. There's probably these lists can be adapted region to region, because there might be some, for example, if you look at ruby-throated hummingbird, there's checks all across the board. It's a migrant. But now look at the black and white warbler. It's an interior forest specialist, so he gets an X. It does not breed in forest fragments. It does use stopover forest fragments during the migration season. Of course, it doesn't breed in residential areas, but there's a question mark for the stopover in residential areas. And what that means is that we were pretty conservative. We need at least 3 studies that conclusively said it used stopover during migration on residential areas. In this case, for black and white, we saw 2 or maybe 1 studies that showed this. So if you look at the yellow warbler there, it had blanks. That means there was no information in the research that we could evaluate, so that was left blank, but it could be adapted for different regions. Talking with people in LA, New York, they have lots of kind of anecdotal evidence that yellow warblers do breed in fragmented riparian areas, so I would probably put a check in the breeds and forest fragments as well. So in summary, tips are conserving forest fragments and individual trees, of course, helps improve habitat scores. And I think the message here is really from ecology, typically everyone thinks in terms of design, big patches and corridors. Well, there's a lot more benefit, even the matrix and fragmented areas that can benefit a whole suite of species. So you can conserve late successional is better than early successional, and larger patches tend to attract more migrants as stopover habitat. So it's not only big patches and corridors, it's also individual trees and forest fragments for this particular taxa. So in summary, there's that Building for Birds online tool. It's available. Please test it out. Send me an email. You can run through the different scenarios to get the scores. And I'm going to end this. I have a little bit of time, 3 minutes. I'm going to talk about an initiative that's called Rewilding of Forest Fragments. Here, the idea is that we have lots of issues with restoration projects in cities and counties because they don't have the staff. I'm like, well, how can we get money to hire a rewilding manager? So I take from example in Pinellas County, they had what we call no-mow areas in parks. And this is how it works. I changed this to rewilding. I think it's a little more sexy than no-mow. If you're interested in learning more about it, you can Google Pinellas County no-mow, and there's some videos about it. And here's essentially what you do. You can do restoration in cities and parks with no cost and even savings for the city. So what you identify is areas that you're going to restore, you're not going to mow or maintain anymore. In Pinellas County, that costs about $70 per acre to mow and weed whack. That cycle about 20 times a year. You do the math, if you can identify 100 acres, that's $140,000 of saving annually. And you can imagine you can do a lot with $140,000 for restoration. Now, the danger, of course, is people take that money and just pocket it. I mean, the city will say, we saved the money, but really is to hire a rewilding manager that will jumpstart restoration, and you can install signage that will engage with the community, because once they see those areas not being mowed, they're like, oh, wait a minute, what's going on here? So you actually do need this signage. There's a book I published a few years ago that gives a lot more detail about this design, construction, post-construction period. If you're interested in our program, that's our website, billgreen.ufl.edu, and my email address is there. Again, I would love feedback from people that when they start using this tool, how it works in planning and design.
Thank you, Mark.
Yep.
Yeah, that was good. And wow, you were right on time, I'd say.
Yes.
So that's great. So I have a couple questions for you, and maybe there'll be some other questions that come in. Please ask everyone your questions. And Mark Locklear, do they write them in the chat room?
The folks, you can use either the Q&A or chat. Q&A is a bit more structured way to do it. So if you could use Q&A for any formal questions, and then Anna, if you'll sort of field those, you'll see a little indicator in Q&A if any questions come in there.
Okay. All right. So I will kick it off though. I have two questions. So the first is, you use birds, and I think there's probably lots of people who love birds. So were birds your way in to talk about this, sort of the hook? Because why not something else? So I was just wondering about that.
Well, the reason to really look at the empirical research, there's a lot of research done on birds. There's a lot less on small mammals. There's some research on larger mammals, and of course butterflies. And so and herps, so frogs and snakes, etc. Birds was chosen mainly because we knew this would be a little problematic, and we wanted to see what we could do that with a taxa that has the most data out there. So of the wildlife species in the kind of that urban rural context, birds are the most studied. So we learned a lot trying to synthesize and create a tool that now our next step is probably branching out to herps, frogs, and small mammals and butterflies. I'm a believer in, and even bees too, like solitary bees, that you plant that one native plant, they find it. It's almost a no-brainer. There's no patch size. I mean, there is in some species, but in general, for butterflies, you plant the native plant, the host plant, the butterfly's going to find it.
Right. Yeah. So, but would the birds, especially those internal forest ones, is that in a way like if you conserve the land that in the forest that they would need, you're taking care of all sorts of other species as well?
Yeah, so the one caveat with this tool is that it's not meant for something like a large forest that you're going to break up. This is meant to be in that urban rural context where it's already fragmented. So typically development is done in this type of context where you have agriculture on the outside of the urban boundary, you have some small forest patches here and there. In that context, you don't find interior forest specialists. So it's really showing you can't do anything to attract interior forest specialists into that area to breed successfully. However, at the same time, those same species that you're not attracting for breeding habitat, they do use tree canopy in residential areas and small forest fragments as they're migrating from the north to the south. And I think that's the one message that gets lost, is everyone's thinking, oh, big patches, we got to keep conserving big patches. And if it's not a big patch, then we don't really care about it. And I think there's one message that needs to be said out there, is that those small patches and even individual trees matter to a whole suite of species.
Okay, that makes sense. All right. So my other one was from, I guess, your first PowerPoint. So I appreciated the 3 phases because there is a lot of discussion on the site design piece, but not a whole lot on the construction and post-construction phase. So on the construction phase, you know, who is your primary audience that you want to get that information out to? And then, like, is there a role for extension, for planners to get that message out?
Yeah, and I think there is for extension and particularly managers. And I'll give you one example that we're trying right now as we speak. And I'll tell a little story here about how we came to this point. So the idea is even during the design phase, you can build in long-term management. And so I'll kind of give you an example. We have in Alachua County an incentive for what we call enhanced stormwater basins. So the idea is simply this. If you are subdividing land in certain overlays, you have to conserve 30 to 50% of the property. Stormwater ponds don't count to that acreage. What the enhanced stormwater pond would do is that, okay, you do an enhanced pond. An enhanced pond means the basins aren't mowed. There's trees planted in the basin. There's native vegetation around there. It's maintained as a more diverse pond instead of mowed lawn all the way around. You can apply for that credit to apply to the open space credit. And so you can imagine the benefit. It's like a density bonus for the developer because now they count that acreage, they can build more homes throughout the site. Well, it failed. I'll tell you why it failed, because you can imagine what happened. The developer comes in, says they're going to do an enhanced stormwater basin, has that on paper, plants a few trees around there. They didn't have very good signage. That wasn't a requirement. We built that in later. Homeowners move into it and they see all this scraggly, you know, they're used to that clean cut stormwater basins. They're like, no, let's cut this. And so they cut it. So when we actually went back a few years later, 99% of the stormwater ponds that got credit for were being mowed again. So how could extension step in here? So what we thought we would do and what the next phase was is actually do a training session through extension where you would only part of the agreement to get the open space credit for these enhanced stormwater basins that they would only hire third-party landscaping companies that have been trained by extension professionals about what it is to maintain these enhanced stormwater basins. Because most landscaping companies are so used to mowing and weed whacking, it's a different type of management style. So you need extension to help train. And then also extension, you can go in and give some training to the homeowners as well with signage and stuff like that to really let them know what these basins are about. And so that's one example. I think extension could really enhance the management over the long term. And
then how about planners?
Well, with planners, I think the planners just need to recognize that I had a student look at open space policies that have been developed by planners all throughout Florida. And there's lots of language about how you calculate how much open space you have to design, but there's very little language that says how you manage it. And if there is language that's management, there's usually no funding attached to it. So what happens, they have a nice little management plan, say, yeah, we'll remove invasives, we'll do this, that, and the other, but there's no money. So in reality, it's just a piece of paper that sits up on the shelf. And so what planners can do is recognize that there needs to be a regulation that says, okay, if you're really going to do conservation of natural open space and think about biodiversity, you got to think of a management plan with teeth. And so to do incentives or regulatory types of policies, they got to have a clause in there saying, where's the funding come from? How's it going to be long term? Who are the third party people that come in and actually manage the open space in a way that conserve biodiversity? I think extension can help train planners to first, A, recognize that that's a problem, and B, think about some policies that could address that problem.
All right. I do not see other questions. Mark, do you see questions? Maybe I'm just not seeing any questions.
Nope, there are none. It's a quiet bunch.
It is a quiet bunch. So I did have a question then about the what is it, Pinell, whatever. The
Pinellas
place that
County.
was not mowing their county parks or city parks.
Yep.
So it was just a portion, right? So they left their soccer field or whatever, and just the parts that were more natural anyway, they just weren't mowing.
Well, you'd be surprised. So I'm not talking about the natural areas. So if you go to any city or county park,
Yeah.
there will be areas that are mowed and weed whacked that people don't use. I mean, this can be like the verges of stormwater ponds or in the back 40 somewhere. And when we went out with the director at Alachua County, we went to 20 different, now these aren't big, I mean, there's lots of parks that are natural already, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about the parks that people use.
Right.
And when we went out there, within a half day, we identified 70 acres that could be, that didn't have to be mowed anymore. They're like, why are we mowing this? It's really one of those things that if you just turn your lens towards it, you can easily save so much money for the county and city, just because whatever reason in the past it's always been mowed, so everyone just keeps mowing. It's kind of that inertia. So you can identify pretty quickly, but you got to have the right director. So what I found when I've worked with different counties so far is some directors just like to mow. There's no getting around it. So
that's just what they do.
Yeah, you're not going to make it. It's like Department of Transportation when we did the road verges. They just like to mow. There's no rhyme or reason beyond that's just what they do. So to convince them, it's a losing battle. So you got to have the right person in higher leadership to get things going. And then once it gets going, then you can actually engage with the public to do, they can start thinking, oh, I can see this transition of this basin that's happening. Maybe I could do my back part of my lot to do the same thing.
Sure. So did you ever get any pushback on that with, they're worried about invasive species or something like that? So then they have to take care of a new problem, perhaps.
Well, the invasives are around, but the way the idea behind that calculation is if you save $140,000, a portion of that can go to the equipment and the herbicides and control methods for those invasives, and that's annually. So the tricky part is to the county director building that in the budget that doesn't just get swallowed up, but actually is a set aside for all those type of tricky problems that will arise when you're trying to restore.
All right. Well, I've run out of questions myself, and it is a quiet bunch. But I thank you for spending the time with us. It was very interesting. Your guidebook and the link is up in the chat, and I have put up an evaluation link as well. So hopefully you will see some people hitting on that, and we'll get an evaluation as well.
And also, just I'd like to remind folks again, this is being recorded. I put a link to this Learn event, this webinar inside chat. So feel free to share that with colleagues or friends who were not able to join us. And then there's also a link on that page to the guidebook that we put in chat. There's an event materials section inside Learn that you have access to that also.
Great. So thank you everyone for attending today, and please check out our next webinar, which will be on June 7th.
All right. Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.
All right,
Thank you.